Thank you, Simon. Kia ora koutou katoa. Hi, it's a real pleasure to be here today. So thank you very much to the Critical Theory Network for the invitation. You've already heard a little bit about where I work, just up the road at Shaw and Whariki. But I thought I'd add just a little whisker more about me before I jump into the presentation. So I'm Pākehā, a blend of Scottish, Irish, Italian and English heritage, and I was born here in Tāmaki Makaurau. And I also did my PhD here at the University of Auckland. So it's really lovely to look around and see some familiar faces here today. So that's me, but back to critical theory, which I think is why we're all here today. And an interest in critical theory is obviously a point of connection for many of us, but I know that our research interests and practices will be quite diverse. So I thought with that in mind, I'd start by orienting a little bit to the kind of work that I do, the position that I work from, the kind of questions that I ask, before jumping into the empirical part of the presentation, where I'll be talking through a few different projects that touch on these issues of perfectibility, pressure, privilege, and personal responsibility. So first up, I do, like a few in the room I can see, I do critical social psychology. And what that means is that I'm interested in discourse. I'm interested in understanding the relationship between the social world and subjectivity, and connecting individual experiences to wider social and cultural forces in a way that attends to power relations. So that probably sounds, fairly familiar to a number of us here, I think. And my work often takes a critical interest in the productive function of language, so figuring out how words and discourse act on the world, how they plug us into particular understandings of reality. And that includes, for example, ideas about who and what is good, what's normal, what's healthy, ideas about the natural order of things and what different people are entitled to, and so on. Ideas about how things should be, how we should interpret and act on the world are of course completely enmeshed with feelings and emotions. So part of an interest in language and discourse for me is also about thinking about emotions, thinking about feelings, and thinking about which emotional styles are considered obvious, appropriate and reasonable, and which are maybe considered unreasonable or unwarranted in particular situations. And I'm interested in, as well, what Margie Weatherall has theorised as effective practices, and how these practices unfold and how they're put to work in particular situations. So hopefully that'll be explained a little bit more as I go along today. And I think this work has a critical and political edge to it because our personal habits of thought and feeling take shape in relation to the social identities that we carry, as well as broader cultural and historical formations. So as we'll see, for example, a person's felt entitlement to question or comment on another person usually relates to the immediate identities that are in play, as well as longer standing social histories. So working with feelings can illuminate power relations and can help us to listen into what Sarah Ahmed calls the effective life of injustice, which I think is quite an evocative phrase. So building on these ideas, my research is empirical and qualitative, and it often involves tuning into the effective discursive scaffolding of inequalities. And I've tended to work with young people in their teens and early 20s trying to get at questions like these. How do young people make sense of everyday inequalities and hardships? How do pressures to manage discrimination and difficulties in the right way relate to privilege? and how do imperatives to be positive, healthy, and your best self, whatever that means, touch down in everyday life. So with that little bit of an intro out of the way, I'm going to talk through a few different collaborative projects and try to highlight how the findings of each speak to some of those bigger ideas mentioned in the title about privilege, personal responsibility, and pressure. And responsibility, I'm thinking about responsibility for success and also responsibility for failure as well. So I'll begin with some recent research I've been involved in at Shaw and Whāriki, working with young people who are deaf or who have mobility or vision impairments. And this work is led by Karen Witten, and it involves colleagues from Massey, but also from AUT and from this university as well. So Robin, who some of you may know, been lucky to have him involved in this project. So one focus of this project was ableism, which I'm sure you're familiar with, but meaning prejudice and false stereotyping around disability, including the idea that disabilities are fixed and static, the idea that people must be able-bodied unless they look disabled, and the idea that people with disabilities have less value and potential than abled people. So that's ableism. And part of my work on this project has been to examine the interactional mechanics of ableism. And I think interactional patterns are really fascinating to study because they surface assumptions about identity, in this case about ability, and about who gets to feel and say what in a given situation. So in everyday situations, we all come face to face with the ableist assumptions that our bodies provoke in others concerning our capacities, our character, and the kind of treatment that we ought to receive. And exactly which assumptions we trigger depends substantially on how other people perceive us in relation to a range of culturally salient markers, and they're often embodied markers as well. So perceived disability status is one primary axis of evaluation, alongside perceived gender, perceived culture and ethnicity, age, class, proximity to beauty ideals, and other markers of perfection. So ableism manifested in the young people who we were talking and working with in their lives in a whole range of ways. Participants described experiencing patterned intrusions, so pattern kind of interruptions and microaggressions while they were out and about doing their thing. And many with visible disabilities recalled being stared at, it's a really common experience, being asked for their diagnosis, and having wheelchairs or mobility aids and bodies touched without other people's permission. That's a couple of examples of these intrusions. So Greer said, random people I have no connection with whatsoever would be like, oh, can you have children? Or Samia said, I've had bus drivers open up the door, see me, and just sigh. Or I've had someone open the door and say, should you even be out at this time of night? So those are a couple of examples of ableist intrusions I'm talking about, the kinds of questions and interruptions that people with visible disabilities experience on a day-to-day basis. And I just want to share one more striking example of what I'm trying to pinpoint. And this is Gemma's account of an experience she had with a customer when she was at work in a stationery shop. It's quite long, I'll read it out. So the customer came up to me with some rolls of paper, and I said, oh, would you like a rubber band? And the customer said, yes. And then she goes, oh, can you roll it up for me? And Gemma said, oh no, I don't do that. I let the customers do it because they're not happy with the way that I do it sometimes, and I just find it difficult to. And the customer said, if you don't roll it up for me, I'm going to refuse service and walk out. So you can maybe think about what perhaps happens next. So Gemma tried to roll up the paper, and then the customer said, "Oh, no, that's not how you do it." She said, "What's wrong with you? Why can't you do it? Are you a paraplegic or something?" And Gemma said, "No, I have cerebral palsy." And the customer said, "Oh, well, you should wear something that identifies you so that you don't get insulted like I just insulted you." I think the ableist logics and ableist effective patterns that you can see here really set the scene for these kinds of interactions. The message for Gemma is clear. You're disabled. You should wear something that identifies you so people like me can classify you correctly. The source of this kind of interactional trouble or misunderstanding is positioned in Gemma's body rather than in the customer's own prejudice. And as a result, the onus falls on Gemma to manage herself to meet the expectations of this customer. This effective discursive circuitry works to make Gemma's body the problem rather than ableist prejudice. And there's some other interesting effective work at play here as well. The young people that we talked to were regular targets of offensive treatment, but at the same time, and like Gemma, many described feeling an obligation to be nice, to avoid making a scene, to answer invasive questions, and generally to take responsibility for the smooth flow of an interaction. And many talked in detail about their strategies for easing interactions along and how they managed them in the right way, which sometimes entailed efforts to educate strangers. So this is Greer's example. So she talked about having people come up to her in a shop and ask her out of the blue about her reproductive capacity. And when I was talking with her about, well, what was your response to that? She said, "Oh, I usually just try to explain and educate. I've always felt that ignorance comes from a lack of education, so maybe this is an opportunity for me to educate or to say something." But you'll notice a striking imbalance here between the effective and interactional workload that gets apportioned to those with visible disabilities to stay calm, to play nice, to educate, versus their able-bodied interlocutors. So it's an imbalance in who is tasked with managing the feelings of others, which on the whole and through repetitions, coming up again and again and again, works to solidify and perpetuate ableist dispositions. And this push to avoid a victim position and to interact politely with people who demonstrate an entitlement to be rude is, of course, not exclusive to ableism. It's also a feature of interactions where other forms of discrimination are at play. And I want to talk a little bit more about that now. So as part of my doctoral research, which was greatly supported and supervised by Nicola Gaby and Jenny Brown, as part of the Sexual Politics Now research program, I looked into teenagers' experiences with everyday sexism, catcalling, intrusions into personal space, diminishment, as well as the kind of punishments that are meted out to young people who don't fit into narrow expectations around masculinity and femininity. And as part of this work, I had conversations with participants about whether and how they might be able to call out and challenge offensive behaviour when they came across it. I was particularly interested in understanding the effective patterns choreographing these sexist interactions, patterns that seem to encourage interactions to move in one direction and to discourage them from moving in others. So you might have a sense of what I'm talking about. You'll likely know that critics of sexism, like critics of ableism, racism, are fairly easily dismissed as being over-emotional or overreacting. As crazy feminists, even Google knows this, crazy feminists making a big deal out of nothing. So when the teenagers that I interviewed tried to challenge sexism, they described being pigeonholed and shut down in precisely this way. So as Georgia said, well, if you say something against it, then you're just a killjoy, or they say, I was only joking. So you really don't want to be that person. And the crazy feminist killjoy stereotype is a really powerful discursive figure. The killjoy overshadows everyday interactions, making women's challenges to sexism appear vindictive and unfounded. And there's intense affective regulation at play here too. As with ableism, participants talked about the importance of managing other people's sexism in the right way, staying cool, calm and collected, educating and persuading people out of prejudice without playing the victim, without being labelled humorless, and without appearing to be overreacting. So as you can probably see, it took really an immense amount of work for speakers to be able to make their accounts of sexism that they'd seen or experienced appear reasonable and not take any of those, fall into any of those traps. And there's another effective imperative at play here as well. The practice of claiming disadvantage, of claiming that you're being affected unfairly by something like sexism or ableism, seemed to place participants in a pretty unpalatable position. And in terms of thinking about why that might be, I think we can persuasively point to some prevailing, individualizing and meritocratic logics as part of the picture, where we're all cast as independent actors responsible for our own successes and failures. And with this in mind, people who complain about inequalities are potentially legible as failures, as people who are failing to take responsibility for themselves and who are simply looking for someone else to blame for the difficulties that they're facing. And I'm really interested in exploring the silencing effects of these depoliticized meritocratic discourses and the feeling rules that seem to stick to them. And that's hopefully a somewhat smooth segue into the second part of my talk, where I'll take a slightly different tack and move from exploring the mechanics of particular instances of prejudice to investigating the more diffuse, effective discursive formations that shape meaning making around structural inequalities, around hardship, distress, and pressure. And the work that I'm doing in this area responds to the third question I have, which is how do imperatives to be positive, healthy, and your best self touch down in everyday life? So at the moment I'm working with whāriki colleagues Tia Carlson and Victoria Lesatele on a project that involves interviewing young people about hauora, well-being. And part of the broader context for the research is public and government concern that you've probably seen in the papers about the declining state of youth mental health in Aotearoa, with a lot of the kind of broad brush statistical evidence that we're seeing suggesting that while young people are behaving better than ever in terms of risk-taking, substance use, measures like that, they seem to be feeling worse, as reflected in high levels of anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicidality. So we're still collecting data in this project. So my analysis here is fairly provisional and light, but I thought I would share some of the preliminary data with you. And no doubt, a lot of the young people that we've interviewed have talked about their fears about the future. That's something that comes through quite a lot. And I'm sure that there are some people in the room who could point to why 16 to 20-year-olds living here in Tamaki Makaurau might have reason to be concerned about what lies ahead for them. Does anyone have anything they want to contribute?
Precarious employment?
Right, yeah, absolutely precarious employment. And that's funny you should say that, Tom, because that actually, he wasn't a plant. That came up quite a lot. So a lot of participants talked about fears about financial security in the future. What kind of job am I going to have? Am I going to have the right qualifications? But this fear was often personalised and individualised. So it gets tangled up with talk about a fear of personal failure, of not being good enough, and of not having prepared early enough and well enough for the futures that await them. So I'll talk you through some examples. So I asked, what do you worry about? This person said, well, just not being able to do it, I guess. That's my greatest fear. Not being able to get where other people in life have already gotten to. That fear of not being able to complete something that other people have completed is scary because it's measuring your worth as a human, how much you can do with something, and how much you can push yourself to do something. Another couple of examples. I always thought that I should always be ready, and I think it's because my parents always say that there's always a lot of competition, and you always have to be ahead of others, otherwise you're not going to get a good future. This one. I know that failing is an option, but I just keep telling myself it's not an option. It's quite a hard one to explain, I guess. You know, it's okay to fail. Like, failing is not a bad thing, but I don't know, it was a very personal pressure that I was putting on myself. So fear about failure as it appears in participants' talk is an individual stress rather than a collective experience, despite being incredibly widespread. Some participants seemed a bit sheepish talking about these, personal pressures, as if the fear of failing itself was an individual foible or weakness that was somehow hard to account for. And I think that this is pretty powerful stuff. So at the age of 16, 17, 18, some of these young people said that they felt like they'd already failed to live up to their potential, that they had already compromised their access to some kind of imagined best future. So this participant was talking about being in year 13, which is the last year of high school here for most students. Suddenly you're having to decide what you want to do and where you want to go with your life. And then you realise you should have done a different subject or hung out with different people, but you can't go back and change that. This other one. I wish I'd done more because it just feels like I might have had potential to do more. I just never really tried. So I feel like if I had actually tried, I might have not turned out differently, but I could have been doing a lot of different things now, and they might have been cool things, but I'll never know. And just to contextualize these are in the context of young people who are, I guess, from an objective perspective, doing really a lot. Participants also seem to find very little space to express struggle and vulnerability, and that lack of space may be particularly acute for young men. So one participant with lived experience of trauma spoke of sadness as a form of psychological weakness, and this isn't something that's new for masculinity, but I think it's important nonetheless. So I have this whole thing that if I show that I'm weak and if I'm sad or feeling down, then I am weak, and with that weakness it's bad and I should shut it down. But interestingly, similar patterns were evident across young people's talk more generally. So this, for example, is a young woman who'd also experienced abuse and neglect, talked in a really similar way about emotional distress as a weakness that individuals need to resolve for themselves. So she's saying, well, there's not going to be someone who's always free for you to talk to. Like, they have those phone lines, but I heard apparently in New Zealand, some of the areas, the people on the phone just tell people to grow up. They'll be like, oh, I don't want to live anymore. And then people will be like, oh, fuck off. Like, because if you keep hearing it, obviously you're going to get a bit irritated They're just like, fuck off, like that, yeah, or get annoyed because you're being annoying, literally. I've seen those reactions before, telling people that you're selfish, like, fuck off, yeah. So my interest here isn't in the accuracy of the helpline anecdote, but in how this notion of distress as pathetic and irritating has cultural currency and how it circulates. In this participant's account, the harsh response from a helpline, fuck off, is understandable because the caller is annoying, is a nuisance, who ought to be able to manage themselves, take responsibility, and not rely on other people for help. So as a final example, and with another project jump, I'd just like to talk briefly about positivity imperatives, which I think are enmeshed in some of the kind of prevailing discursive resources and feeling rules that I've discussed so far, particularly centred around personal responsibility. So with University of Auckland colleagues Marie Martinussen, Margie Wetherall and Alex Tant, I'm looking at how imperatives to think positive and look on the bright side shapes women's everyday meaning making and emotional practices. And as this project moves forward, we're hoping to delve a bit deeper into some of these patterns and the kind of identity formations that are required for relentless positivity. And this project is also in its early stages, but I wanted to share a couple of extracts with you today. So the first one is a participant in her early 30s, so this is a slightly older cohort, but still youth adjacent. Horrible word. Talk about her experience of a life-changing accident and a relationship breakup. So she said, I think I was so upset because all my goals had sort of gone out the window. I didn't know what my recovery would have been like, and I think I wasn't the positive person for a little bit, that I sort of feel like I am at heart because I was so sore. And so the person I was with ended up breaking up with me a few weeks after my accident, and when I reflected on it, I was like, I should have been more positive. If I had been happier, if I had been more positive, he would have sort of stayed with me. So I tried not to kind of over-exaggerate it too much, but you'll have noticed the kind of pausing and puzzling out that's evident here in this extract. The interviewee has to think quite carefully as she builds this account and marshal a few different lines of evidence to produce a persuasive and legitimate argument about why she wasn't her usual positive self in the aftermath of this pretty serious accident. And we can see in her account that a person's mindset, their mental resilience and positivity, is positioned as the determinant of what happens to them. So the moral of the story here is, if I had been more positive, he would have stayed with me. And the notion of personal responsibility for one's own psychological state is also really evident in this extract. And this participant is talking about her response to her dog being quite seriously ill. She said, I remember just being so grateful that my dog was healthy again and taking him for a walk. And I remember saying to myself, you're letting his health dictate your mental state, because when he was unhealthy it was destroying you, and when he is now healthy you're over the moon and so grateful and so happy. And I said to myself, you need to be okay with letting him go. I just don't want my mental health to be reliant on external situations, which is people are external to you. Yeah, you know? Like, I'm responsible for me, and I'm the only person I can control. And therefore I need to make sure that I take responsibility, don't take that responsibility lightly, and don't try to rely on someone else to dictate my mental health. In this account, distress at the illness of a loved one is positioned as a psychological vulnerability that it's the participant's responsibility to control through emotional management and through eliminating reliance on anything external to her. And I think this extract is a good place to finish because it really picks up and runs with some of the key patterns and motifs that I've been discussing today, related to personal responsibility particularly, and dealing with pressure and distress. So to conclude, I set out today in a rather kind of loose way with the aim of pulling some common threads through 4 different research projects that are working or have been working with 4 quite different groups of people. And what intrigues me across the 4 different projects is that the thinking and feeling and explaining rules that are readily available to articulate discrimination and difficult experiences seem to invite narratives where people are made responsible for their own distress and failure. At the same time, broader, more systemic pressures as well as particular instances of discrimination may be hard to name persuasively. And as we've seen, imperatives to protect the feelings of others seem to skip over the more privileged and land heavily instead on those who are disadvantaged. So we've seen that here in the case of ableism and sexism, but it's a dynamic that's more widespread as well. And these patterns are evident, I think, as I said, across the projects and how young people talk about their futures and how interviewees talk specifically about their experiences with prejudice and discrimination, and how participants across the range of projects talk about their emotions and emotional management. But in drawing attention to these patterns, I don't want to suggest that there's no variability, no flexibility or agency in how these prevailing resources get mobilised, or that stress and pressure can only be articulated in these quite narrow ways. That's certainly not the case. But I hope to have highlighted some loops of connection between a broader, politically charged cultural common sense and people's everyday meaning making.